I just thought it'd be relevant to talk about the ability to mentally prepare yourself for negative messages and not taking things personally in business. And we've all heard kind of the statement of, business is business, personal is personal, but there is still finesse to it. There is still a lot to mentally just digest as you're trying to filter through some of the feedback that may come from family members, from loved ones, as we just shared, or anybody else that touches you in your day-to-day life. So, just kicking this off, curious, have you had any experiences that you want to share about
No,
that?
I'm
That's
just
great.
kidding.
Yeah, wonderful.
No, for me, this has been a major growth area over a lot of years of trying to not take things so personally. I don't know if it's the way we grew up or just inherent to my personality. I tend to take things very personally, because I want to do things perfectly. I want things to be the best for people. And so when someone gives feedback that I view as a criticism or a negative, I tend to immediately assume that it's something personal to me versus a circumstance or something else going on in someone else's life, or just simply feedback that I don't necessarily have to engage with. Um, I've done a lot of work trying to separate when that immediate feeling comes up, because I think a lot of people don't pause there. They immediately go down, it's personal, or they dismiss it without pausing between the feedback and how their reaction is. Does that make sense?
It does, and I always kind of I like to kind of segment maybe parts of the thought process or parts of the behaviors, at least from
Yeah.
my end, that I've had to deal with. And there is the one of like, what's the conversation like? What are you talking about? How are you selling it? How are you pitching? What are you asking for? That's one. The second is the response,
Yeah.
right? What do they say? And then the third, always to me, is how are you interpreting it? How are you perceiving that? Are you cutting it off and saying this is only a business conversation, or I have this perspective over here? Let's talk about it. Are you prepared to have a response from their response? So I do like to kind of break this down because I think to your point, there's a lot that can happen. Sometimes if you're not sometimes, most of the time, if you're not prepared, it can catch people off guard. But people also enter a lot of relationships and a lot of conversations not really thinking about what's going to happen on the back end. I've got this really good best case scenario over here, and there really
Yeah.
isn't a lot of thought process around like, what's the pushback going to be? What are they going to say if they don't like it? How am I going to respond? Do I have counter arguments? And I think each of those we don't necessarily need to break them down today, but I do think that those are worthy of people considering as you're entering into various conversations and situations.
Yeah. And I think it's, yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to segment those things, those conversations, and try to prepare as much as possible. I would also say that there are, of course, situations that will come completely out of the blue where you didn't know someone was going to give you that feedback, or you didn't know that they wanted to engage in a conversation, or it could just be in a casual conversation and, a comment comes through that completely takes you off guard. And what I've learned trying to be better is probably in that unplanned spot is where I find the most emotion coming up around a comment or feedback, because I didn't have the mental preparation to prepare, what potentially they could say, how I was going to respond, build that emotional resilience ahead of time.
Yeah.
Um, I've also found in that scenario where it's unplanned and someone is saying something or engaging in a conversation, I've learned to try and also read body cues,
Mhm.
because words, and I can use this example from you, sometimes you come off very aggressive, or the tone of voice is harsher than maybe I would deliver something when it comes to feedback. But by looking at body cues, I'm able to then say, does the tone match the visual that I'm getting? Yes, no. Okay, well, if it doesn't, maybe I'm filtering this feedback in a more negative way than it's meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one area of growth that we forget about, is becoming more adept at looking for body cues, being aware of how we're presenting body cues, also in conversation, because I just listened to this great podcast about creating feedback loops with people. So if you know something is hard, or someone says something and you immediately cross your arms, or you bring up your shoulders, in frustration, that creates the same behavior pattern with them that can actually worsen the conversation and make you both less likely to hear the feedback in a non-personal manner.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think that there's a lot you can digest in this. Body cues are a fantastic example of that. The arm crossing thing, is a big one. And I'll just, I want to touch on this and then move more towards a different topic. But the arm crossing thing always makes me laugh because I naturally cross my arms. I just have
I do.
long arms. So I sit like this because it's really comfortable. It's not that I'm not engaged in the conversation, and I
Yeah.
get beat up personally a lot for it, but I'm like, my arms are so heavy and lanky, right? It's like not comfortable for me to do that. I don't have a better position. So, all that to say, I think that is really interesting, but pivoting kind of back to, I guess, where I wanted to take the conversation is that internal monologue piece that we have, because there is that feedback where, let's just keep picking on the arm crossing thing, right? You're having a
Yeah.
conversation with somebody, you're reading their body cues, they cross their arms, immediately in your head,
Yeah.
you're like, "Ooh, this isn't going well." And in reality, that may not be the case. And
Yeah.
so what I really try to do is I try to step back and I say, okay, how do I put myself in that person's shoes? What is their perspective? Everybody's going to have a different perspective. It's not an immediate jump to, oh, they push back. I'm the worst thing in the world. This is going terribly. And that piece where you're in your mind and you have to distract yourself and say, hey, I'm, and sorry, not distract, but pivot the internal monologue to say, hey, this may not be about me, or I might need to ask a clarifying question, or can I open this up and ask them a question and see how they're feeling about things, so it doesn't turn into I'm going down this bad rabbit hole. Now I'm spinning myself deeper and
Yeah.
deeper. And that takes a lot of practice. And I think when you enter a conversation and again, we talk about this all the time with habitual growth, it's not necessarily about the end outcome. Yes, we want to make the sale. Yes, we want to help somebody, but it's what am I learning in this process, right? How can I regain control, or how can I steer my mind in a different way? Those small wins add up to be a lot, and you learn to control your emotion and how your mind tends to jump around.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting about the inner monologue that you tell yourself. And maybe just for anybody that's interested in trying to do that, one of the things that I've learned through a lot of practice and trying to control my inner monologue, because once it starts, it rapidly goes down a rabbit hole, is to actually verbally acknowledge something that somebody said in a way that says, I hear you, but allows you to say, I don't have to take this feedback right now. I'm going to think about it. So I'll say something like, oh my gosh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Let me put some thought behind that, and maybe we can revisit this conversation. So you have validated whatever somebody is saying is, yep, I heard you, but it gives you a break from going down a rabbit hole internally as the conversation is unfolding to say, okay, I'm going to revisit this later when I'm not in this moment where I feel like my emotions might start to take over, or I can feel them coming up. And I actually want to think about it. And it's totally okay if in that, later time you go, yeah, this wasn't really relevant to me.
Yeah.
I don't need to take it personally. And it gives you space to, like you said, put yourself in that other person's shoes.
Mhm.
Um, I'll give us a silly example. One of my daughters, who is a teenager, loves to say things. And sometimes I take them personally. And then I have to step away and go, okay, do I remember when I was a teenager? This is a phase of life. Like, I don't think she meant it personally. Like, do I have areas of growth? Of course, that I can work on. But just creating that own space through validation, but allowing yourself time later
Mhm.
to disconnect from an emotional standpoint and really understand, is it true? Do I care enough to do something about it? And then do I need to follow up on a conversation at a later time?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just kind of a method that I've started to use.
No, and I think that's really powerful. I think that's well said. You don't have to solve everything in the moment, right? I
Yeah.
think sometimes that's the other piece that people miss is patience, right? It's one person says something, the other person responds back because they're offended, and then it just escalates. And if you're not that type of person, or if you've graduated into a different type of relationship where it's like that still stings, but like we can make it through, but it still is ruminating in your mind, you can revisit it in a different way. You can give yourself a little bit of patience and say, okay, either I need to clarify this, we need to address this again. Hey, this is really bothering me because we have this strong relationship. Or, it has to be, hey, they're a teenager. They don't necessarily
Yeah.
understand the grasp of life. I told this silly story to you earlier before we started recording. It's like I gave my son who's 4 a pair of boots for Christmas. Big miss. Like, I mean, he wanted a toy that he could play with. I mean, he literally just he opened up the boots and he walked outside and threw them in the snow and started bawling and ran upstairs. And as a parent, that breaks your heart, but at the same time, you have to realize, okay, this is just a moment. There's other people around. I'm a little offended, right? But like, he's not going to know that stuff, right? I can't hold him to that expectation. Doesn't mean the pain isn't there, doesn't mean, right?
Yeah.
It still doesn't hurt. It's a digestion process. You're digesting the information, the circumstances, whatever. You can revisit it, which I did with him, right? To try to say, hey, here's all the things that went into it. Here's the thought. Here's why. And again, logic doesn't always make sense for a 4-year-old, probably not a
Right.
teenager as well, but at least you can dissociate from that immediate event and then start to have a different conversation and a different thought process. And the reason I wanted to talk about this topic today was because of that experience, but it also translates into a lot of the business relationships that I've had as well, right? It takes a lot of goes, it takes a lot of finessing. And if you focus on, hey, here's what I can control, here's my thought process, I'm aware of it, I'm intentionally going into a conversation, I'm going to respond in this way. If I don't like what they say, we'll get through it. I might have to revisit it, but at least
Yeah.
I'm not jumping into, wow, woe is me. And now I'm this victim and I'm going down this bad path that nobody wants to be around.
Yeah. That made me think. So in in a professional setting, let's talk about business for a second, whether you're a business owner or you work in a business, you're an entrepreneur, whatever that could look like. It can be really hard not to take things personally, especially if you've put a lot of time and effort into a project, into, trying to get a sale, whatever that might be. Um, and I've done a lot of contemplating around this topic about why sometimes I might feel more offended from a personal standpoint or dismissive of feedback. And one thing that I found is when I sit and think about my immediate reaction, is it linked to a certain person or specific persons? And why is that? Is that because I don't necessarily respect that person and therefore immediately put up a defensive wall and say, well, your feedback doesn't matter?
Yeah.
Or I respect that person so much and I have poured personally into that relationship or that project that when I get feedback, it's hard to disassociate those feelings because it does feel personal because I care so much. So I think just a quick, maybe a reminder for people is not only think about the feedback that you're getting and your emotional response to it, but go one step further and think about why. Why does it matter coming from that person? Because that might actually help you build a strategy to take things less personally,
Yeah.
specifically for those people that may potentially trigger you or you may not want to be as open to their feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's good. That opens up a whole different topic that
We can talk about it a different time.
we should talk about it at a different time. Accepting feedback and being open and
Yeah.
willing, I think is really good. But yeah, I mean, this has been great. I think there's a lot of really tangible nuggets, hopefully, that come out of this for people. Mostly be aware what's happening in your
Right.
own mind. Look for those associations. Look for that value. Why are things happening the way they are? Was I not prepared? Am I prepared? Am I just offended because of something historic? Is it just my ego needs to be squished for a little bit so I can accept that feedback, whatever it is? I mean, there's a lot packed in that. But if you're aware of the conversation, you're not instantaneously jumping to conclusions or this negative feedback loop, but you're really thinking
Yeah.
about, hey, what's been said? How do I incorporate this if I want to incorporate that? And I don't take it personally, and then you just move on, and it's a lot easier to stay focused in that capacity because you're learning something along the way. So
Yeah, absolutely.
awesome. All right. Well, good topic.
All right.
Good to see
Yes.
you.
Good luck finding a new Christmas present.
Yeah.
All
All right. We'll talk next week.
right. Sounds
Bye.
good.